We are pleased to have with us another of its influential leaders, Dr. Benjamin Hooks. Dr. Hooks is the Executive Director of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP is the oldest civil rights organization in the world. Dr. Hooks, welcome to WorldNet.
Thank you.
Now let's go to our participants standing by in Georgetown. Please remember to identify yourself and your organization. Go ahead, please, in Georgetown.
Good afternoon, Dr. Hooks. David DeCary, Stabrook News, Georgetown. The National Urban League has just released its 13th annual State of Black America paper. The president of the league, John Jacob, has accused the Reagan administration of undermining civil rights, charging that its officials have liberated people to be discriminatory. Would you care to comment on that?
The National Urban League, a State of Black America, is a very important document. It's well researched, well substantiated, and while I have not had a chance to see the latest copy, I use it as a research tool in my office all the time, and I would tend to agree with the assessments that they have made, and particularly with the ones you referred to. There's no question about the fact that the past few years have not been friendly years for the civil rights movement in America.
Thank you, Georgetown. We will now go to the Port of Spain, and we'd also like to welcome Port of Spain on their first WorldNet program. Go ahead, please.
Well, we thank you very much for the opportunity of participating in the program, Dr. King, and we accept this with great pride. Gideon Hanuman-Singh, NBS Radio 610. How influenced or how successful have the visions of Dr. King been in influencing social justice in the United States over the passage of time?
The work of Dr. King has been monumental and tremendously successful. One has to understand that in the civil rights movement there have been several strains that have been moving along. My own organization, NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was organized in 1909. And we had been out there working and struggling for equality primarily through what we call demonstration legal cases and through the Congress. We succeeded in 1954 in having the Supreme Court hand down a unanimous decision called Brown versus Board of Education that wiped out the legal concept of separate but equal. I was a lawyer at that point, and I was working with the NAACP as a lawyer, and I remember commenting at the time, and this was a year before the movement in Montgomery, Alabama, that would only be a matter of time, none of us knew how long, before all the walls would come down. When Dr. King successfully led the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, it was against that background. And ultimately, it was a court victory that mandated that they could no longer segregate against blacks by making them sit in certain seats. So that this movement that Dr. King led during his lifetime was a movement that was designed to desegregate America. Now, by and large, through the court actions, through decrees of Congress, through legislation passed by cities and states, we have rid ourselves of most of the racial obstacles as a matter of law. The fact remains, however, that we have not achieved, as a matter of fact, all of the victories we won by law. And every day and every way, we find ourselves, those of us still involved in the civil rights movement, with the difficult job of implementation, trying to make sure that what is written in the law is observed in practice. And in that regard, literally millions of cases, if you were to deal with all of them, job discrimination, discrimination in various ways about the Voting Rights Act, discrimination in public accommodations, discrimination as it relates to being able to buy or rent apartments or get insurance and so forth, so that there are many things left to be done. But I would say on balance that the great movement started back short after slavery, so far as that is concerned, and moving across these 120-some years, epitomized by Dr. King during his brilliant lifetime, that movement is going ahead, and we still find many obstacles, but we are overcoming them one by one.
Thank you, Port of Spain. We will now return to Georgetown. Go ahead, please, in Georgetown.
Adam Harris, New Nation. Would you care to state what have been some of the significant achievements of your organization since the Rosa Parks incident?
Well, the Rosa Parks incident came in 1955. The Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, which provided for public accommodations. The change, the Voting Rights Act perhaps was the most significant. Now, the NAACP alone cannot claim credit for any of these things, but working in concert with other organizations, both black and white, Jewish and Gentile. And we did have a great coalition during those days of concern to people, both black and white. It's important to remember that because we were dealing with a Congress that had 100 white senators. And we were dealing with a House of Representatives that had perhaps all white members except for maybe at that time 7 or 8 or maybe 9 at the most. So it was necessary to have a coalition of conscience, and that we were able to achieve. And I think the Voting Rights Act, which meant that no white politician in the South now can really expect to be elected, particularly on a Democratic ticket, without substantial black support. In the recent nomination fight over Robert Bork to be a Supreme Court justice, the power of that black vote was evident. When one remembers that through most of the South, black folk, either by political pressure, by actual physical violence or brutality, by so-called literacy tests, by payment of poll tax, by intimidation or coercion, that most black in the deep South did not have a chance to vote. When those blacks achieved that opportunity and started to flock into the polls, it not only meant that we now have 400 elected black officials in the state of Mississippi, where at one time we only had a black mayor in Mount Bayou, which is an all-black town. It not only means that we have black officials in the state Senate and state House all over the South, and sheriffs and county supervisors, et cetera, et cetera. It means that the white office holders, mayors, county commissioners, city council people, governors, and senators have to be more responsive to the voice of the black community. So I could go on and on. We've had some significant victories of many kinds, but I think that it is in the field of voting, in the field of what we call public accommodations and the various sections of the civil rights law that mandated equality of opportunity, the federal government establishing some goals and timetables, the Justice Department under every president since '55, except for President Reagan, giving great service and filing lawsuits to make sure that women, blacks, and other minorities were not excluded from the workplace. These are some of the significant contributions that the civil rights agencies, including mine, have made since the Rosa Parks boycott.
Father Andrew Morrison of the Catholic Standard, Georgetown. Mr. Hooks, could you say what support you get from the press in the United States? I know in 1963 there was great support at the time of the troubles in the South, and especially brought out in the case of Sullivan versus the New York Times. Has that support continued? Are you satisfied with the support you get, your movement gets from the press in the States at the present time?
No, not precisely. But let me say that even in 1963, and I was looking at the film clips a moment ago, I was privileged to be present in 1963 at the March on Washington. I was privileged to be present in 1968 at Mason Temple when Dr. King delivered his last speech. I was at the hospital when he was pronounced dead. I was at the funeral. I took part in the Poor People's March. And I remember the newspaper coverage during the 50s and 60s. Basically, we got very little support from the print press of this country. Very, very little support. In fact, most Southern papers had a great degree of anger about the King movement or the NAACP movement or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee or CORE. When they came to town, they would say these troublemakers have come to town to disturb the status quo. And the status quo was the white community being on top and the black community lying almost prostrate and helpless. We did have a small amount of support from the print press in the North, but that was not consistent. It was rather spotty. And the paper you mentioned, the New York Times, was of course among the foremost to give support during those days, and there were others that gave support. But the principal support, strangely enough, came from the electronic media and particularly television. And what happened was, it was not so much them supporting, but the actual physical drama of a sheriff using a bullwhip on helpless people, of a fire department squirting them with high-pressure fire hoses, of tear gas and mace and howling police dogs, and billy clubs being applied with great force and brutality against youngsters and middle-aged people who are out there marching with no defensive mechanisms. It was a simple physical raw drama of what happened. I don't think that television necessarily took a part, except that as we moved through those difficult years, it became apparent that many of the reporters who came from the North particularly did finally get disturbed, excited, agitated, and bothered that all of this force was brought to bear against the people who were simply trying to exercise, at that time, very elemental and elementary rights: the right to drink from a water fountain without restriction, the right to use the restroom, the right to enjoy the facilities of a bus station or a train station. And by the way, the NAACP had already won a decision that we had a right to use them. It finally was a sheer physical drama. And that is why, in my judgment, South Africa today says that they don't want it covered, because television doesn't have to take a side or a stand. When, with that omnipresent eye, they record the history of what is happening, it brought about a wave of sympathy, and I dare say, except for the electronic media, the fight would have been much more difficult. So we did enjoy support, but I don't think it was planned, that it was deliberate so much as it was a telling of the story. And as an outgrowth of telling that story, even hardened newspaper people became convinced that the authorities in the South were wrong and that the black people were morally right. And finally, at the end, I think they were a part of it. And I have seen in some of those little dusty chapels in the South, when the demonstrators or the protesters, both black and white, would start singing those freedom songs, I have seen hardened television reporters caught up, and I saw them finding themselves singing also.
Thank you, Georgetown. We will now return to Port of Spain. Go ahead, please, in Port of Spain.
Dr. Hooks, this is Jones Madeira of Trinidad and Tobago Television.
We're apparently having some technical problems. We'll now return to Georgetown. Go ahead, Georgetown.
The NAACP have links with overseas human rights organizations. I know that in your own career you've been very active on the question of South Africa. And finally, what is your opinion of the doctrine of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, which is frequently raised in that and other connections?
Well, we had the doctrine of non-interference raised in my lifetime when Italy occupied Ethiopia in a bloody, unnecessary war. We had the doctrine of non-interference when Hitler, with his Moravian troops, violated the sovereignty of many fine countries, and we have been given to understand, in light of hindsight, that had the Western powers taken a more aggressive stand, that he may have retreated. We have seen the doctrine of non-interference raised in South Africa, but at the same time, we've seen the doctrine of interference raised in Nicaragua and other Central American countries. I say to this national government of America, you can't have it both ways. And South Africa proclaims and professes to be a democracy and a part of the first world in terms of nationhood. And I don't think that civilized nations, having gone through the experience of Hitler's Germany and the Nazi March and the murder and deprivation and violence that ensued from failing to take a stand, can sit back now and talk about non-interference. I think that, however, before we have to actually interfere, there are many other sanctions that this government can take, including withdrawal of diplomatic recognition, including prevention of planes landing in South Africa from America or in America from South Africa, including embargoes against some materials. There are many things that can happen before we have to, that may be called interference, of course. But what I'm saying is that I don't think that the civilized world can stand by and see the Nazi-like conditions in South Africa exist, knowing that they exist, and turn their back and do nothing under some cynical guise of non-interference.
Does the May I just follow up briefly? The first part of the question again. Does the NAACP have links with overseas human rights organizations?
So far as we can. However, as you probably have heard, we have a very limited budget, and our major effort in the last several years has been the whole continent of Africa. And to the extent that we can interface, we send representatives to meetings, both international and national, with representatives of human rights organizations across the world.
Mr. Hooks, Adam Harris, New Nation again. What would you consider to be some of your major problems, or the major problem facing your organization in pursuit of this objective of equality or total equality for blacks in the United States?
The major problem we face now, in my judgment, has been that our present national administration has not been forthright, in our judgment, in trying to enforce the laws that we have, in sounding a clear trumpet that the nation will not tolerate racial or sexual discrimination. But when you see the fight about the Supreme Court, putting on the Supreme Court nominees who believe in whatever that means, original interpretation, or who don't want to expand the role of the court in interpreting the Constitution, which can be taken to mean keeping black folk locked in where they were many years ago, the major problem facing us is perhaps political, in that we have to get a better political climate. That black folk and people who think in terms of liberality and the growing expansion of the country faced in this political year of 1988. Secondly, we have an economic problem. We have allowed our deficit to double in 7 years. This administration has created a national debt twice what it was when they came into office, and we have created a tremendously large foreign national debt, a deficit in balance of trade, which means that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jobs are being lost. Now, when you take the political climate, the economic climate, then you look at a situation where, unfortunately, many young blacks feel that this country no longer offers them hope within the system. And so there's no question that, as Dr. Wilson, the sociologist from the University of Chicago, has said, that we are developing a black underclass beset and besieged by dope and unemployment and hopelessness and despair. And while the NAACP is basically a civil rights organization, because of our vast network of 2,300 branches across the nation, because of our large membership of more than 500,000 located in every village, township, and hamlet where there's a large black population, we are devoting some of our resources to working within our own community, within our own race, to elevate the level of hope and consciousness and expectation through some programs that we are evolving that have the potential of trying to stop this drive toward racial despair brought about we think in part by so many years of real honest despair. But as we face the larger picture, we face this political problem of a better political climate, an economic climate of creating more jobs and more opportunity, and thirdly, a housing problem that has all but strangled the inner cities that we sometimes refer to as the ghetto, strangled them because there's been no upward mobility. Historically in America, if people got richer, they moved up and out, and another class moved up and in, and that movement kept some homes available for all people. Today, housing has become so tremendously high, so difficult, that there's very little housing being created for the middle class, and therefore there's no movement. And for those at the very bottom of the economic scale, they are being squeezed into less and less space for more and more people. These three great concerns we have.
Thank you, Georgetown. Now let's return to the Port of Spain. Go ahead, Port of Spain.
This is Port of Spain here. Dr. Hooks, I trust you're hearing us this time. Okay, they're hearing us this time. I wanted to take you back to your analysis of the situation in the South a few moments ago, and also your discussions on the type of climate in which black people in the United States are living at the moment. To what extent has that climate been affected by the recent developments in New York and the Howard Beach trial and the developments around that?
Well, the strange thing is that we have seen, let me just say this first of all, the strange thing is we have seen a resurgence and a rise in overt racial hatred and activity manifested by such organizations as the Ku Klux Klan that march just as readily in California or New York or Connecticut, which are northern states, as they once marched in Mississippi, Arkansas, and Tennessee, the deep South states. I think that most people were caught by surprise, and I live a great deal of the time right now in New York City, have been surprised by the rise of ugly, raw racism in New York City, epitomized by the Howard Beach incident, but also by the Bernie Getz case. And that is the case where a young white man said that he felt he was going to be mugged. He was not mugged. He said he felt he might be, and he pulled out his pistol on the subway and shot four young black men, and shot one of them the second time after he was lying prostrate and helpless on the subway bench, and made a confession in which he said the only reason he didn't shoot more because he didn't have any more to shoot, any more bullets to fire. So that young man, that young white man, became dramatized as a folk hero. The recent incidents that have happened in New York City include a great number of incidents involving police brutality and killings by white police officers of black citizens. So there's a ferment in New York City today, and Howard Beach is just the tip of the iceberg. Actually, people have not been assimilated in New York in terms of blacks and whites. They've simply been living in the same city. Black folk largely in certain parts of Brooklyn, Long Island, the five boroughs in certain places, and white people in other places. And while we may ride the subway together or attend sports events together, there have been no great assimilation in all of these years, in my judgment, between the black and white populations. And what we see is a result of economic deprivation, overcrowding, and a certain degree of insensitivity in the national press now, because racism is no longer a number one problem. There's a certain complacency, a certain attitude that black folk have all that they should get now. If they're getting more, they're getting something that belongs to white folk. We've heard the cry of reverse discrimination, which means that certain white people are saying every time a black gets a job, they shouldn't have it, they're not qualified, and it should have gone to a white person. All of these things that are happening to us are not surprising, however, because in Dr. King's lifetime, he pointed out that in the ocean, if you see a tide moving in one direction at the surface of the ocean, there's another even stronger tide moving in a different direction, perhaps in subterranean channels. So what we have in America, and this is a nation that is like that, the pendulum swings from one side to the other. And for a very brief moment in time, in the 1960s, there was a concern, a compassion, a genuine desire on the part of this nation to do better. That pendulum has now swung to the center first, where we didn't do anything, and now to the other side, where I think there are positive steps being taken to negate the progress of blacks. So Howard Beach is symptomatic of something. And let me just say that we have these incidents in various parts of the country, but I think Howard Beach attracted attention because for so many years, New York City had the reputation of being the citadel of civil liberties and human rights consciousness, and indeed it is perhaps still that. And that is why any incident that happens there is worse than that happening anywhere else. But there is a great deal of overt, covert, actual hostility and racism in New York City, just as there is anywhere else in this nation.
Dr. Hooks, this is Vernon Guichard, president of Club Louverture. I wish to ask, notwithstanding the statute law of the land, to what extent is government's policy actively directed towards the promotion of equity in the economic and engagement of the services of the black population in American society?
Well, that is a twofold question, because when we talk about government in the United States of America, we first of all talk about a national government that has great and enormous powers. Then we now have seen a shift in many arenas of power to the states and even to local cities. Now, in these cities, let's start there, to the amazement of some, consternation of others, and to the gratification of many of us, many individual cities have passed civil rights ordinances, set-asides for minority contractors. A set-aside, as you know, is usually a business term, meaning that a certain percentage of business done by the city must be done by minorities, which opens a whole gateway of opportunity. We have city human rights commissions, and they investigate allegations of racism and sexism perpetrated in that city. Then we move to the state level, and there's been an amazingly good increase of state human relations agencies. I remember in my home state of Tennessee some 25 years ago when we could only have an advisory commission and had one secretary. Today, that agency has 60 or 70 employees, a large budget, offices in 7 cities in the state, and they handle thousands of complaints every year at the state level. I'm going through this hurriedly, so that we have seen for the first time in America in the last 20 years, cities and states in large measure living up to some governmental responsibility in the area of human and racial relations. At the national level, we had the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. We had the Equal Opportunity Commission that had large budgets and staffs, and for many years they did some excellent things. We've seen, from the NAACP perspective at least, a rollback in real constructive efforts of the national government at the executive level, making changes that would be beneficial to the large masses of blacks. And of course, let me hasten to add that no chain is any stronger than its weakest link. Therefore, when I speak about America doing things for black people, I am saying, in effect, that black people being a part of this America need to be helped into first-class citizenship, because by helping them, we help the whole of America. It's not pitting black against white. It's simply making the whole of America a stronger team in these days. The national government, of course, also has its legislative branch, and they exercise a certain amount of power. And even though the fight has been difficult, we've had more success in the past 7 years since I've been here at the NAACP in getting some help from the legislative arm. Judicially, which is another form of government in America at the national level, judicially we're almost at a standstill. We have not had too many real setbacks, but we've not had any new great groundbreaking rules being made or cases being decided in our favor. So it's sort of very stable there, but not as progressive as we'd like to see it. That is why NAACP and most of the civil rights organizations opposed Judge Bork for the Supreme Court because we felt in a 9-person court that has often divided 5-4 that he would vote on the wrong side and the 5-4 would be against us rather than in favor of us. So that it's a mixed bag. But let me give you a general answer to that very fine question. Basically, government of America, whether local, state, or national, is not doing all they could, or not doing all they could, rather, to advance the cause of black people. But it is so much better than it formerly was. And you've got 295 black mayors, and some of them preside over the largest cities in America: Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Birmingham, Philadelphia. And the presence of these black women and men in office at the highest level means a greater and deeper commitment. 23 black people now serving in the National House of Congress, and many of them have achieved seniority and committee chairmanships, and they're able to influence the policy better. We think that the climate of the national government executive branch has been very weak, however, in the enforcement of rights for black people in America.
Mr. Hooks, I'm Edison Carr from Radio Trinidad. What is your view on the profile of blacks in entertainment? The motion picture industry is very powerful, television is very powerful. Apart from the big names in entertainment, especially television and motion picture, do you think that blacks still have small and or meaningless roles in the entertainment industry in America?
I served for 5 years as a commissioner on the Federal Communications Commission, commonly known as the FCC. In those days, 1972 to 1977, the FCC exercised a great deal of power and influence on equal opportunity employment and therefore programming. In fact, we took the position upheld by the courts that if black folk were not employed behind the cameras, the lack of their input would be seen on the camera. And so we had a crusade for equal opportunity employment. And since the Hollywood production studios produced much of the drama, the plays, and the programs for television, indirectly we affected their operations also. For many, many years, in fact, since 1919, NAACP has been concerned about the entertainment industry. We conducted a boycott of a movie known as Birth of a Nation, very discriminatory, inflammatory film back in 1919. And all of those years we've been going back and forth to the Hollywood industry. In fact, right now, the NAACP last year released a report called The Discordant Sound of Music, in which we pointed out the many defects of the record industry. We have had ongoing investigations and parleys with the entertainment industry, and we're very unhappy with the general tenor of it. The fact of the matter is, however, that to be fair, we've made a great deal of progress. I remember when I went to the FCC, there were only 19 owned black radio stations in the whole nation out of more than 7,000. Today, there are perhaps over 200. There was not a single black-owned television station in 1972 out of 700. Today, there are possibly 8 or 10. So that while we complain about the progress we haven't made, I want to make it emphatically clear that this system of government that we have has made it possible for us within the system to make great and dramatic changes. In fact, were I to go back and wake up somebody who lived in the era of Step and Fetch It, or Bill Bojangles Robinson, the great tap dancer, relegated to Uncle Tom parts, or Butterfly McQueen, and bring them back to see the Bill Cosby show on television, or Different Strokes, or to see the many black stars, heroes and heroines that we have, they would be utterly amazed. So while I am not satisfied, and we are not satisfied with the progress that's been made, we are making a great deal of progress, and incrementally, we make a few steps every year. We just finished what we call the NAACP Image Awards. And these images are what we're concerned about, how are black folk portrayed. And a part of that portrayal has to do with producers, directors, script writers, cameramen or camera people, all of the multitudinous crafts that make up the entertainment industry, as well as the actors and actresses. And it's a never-ending, never-ceasing struggle. Some years we think we're making some progress, and the next year we seem to go backward. But on balance, the progress continues. And it's important because in America, by the time a child is 18, they will have spent more time watching television than they will have spent in the public school system. What they see, what they hear on that screen largely determines what type of people they are going to be. So we must be eternally vigilant in making sure that the television screens and the movie industry and the record industry, all the great mass cultural movements, do not wrongly portray, defame, or exploit black people in this nation.
Thank you, Port of Spain. We will now return to Georgetown. Go ahead, please, in Georgetown.
Father Andrew Morrison of the Catholic Standard again, Dr. Hooks. Could you tell us what sort of support you get from the churches, especially the church to which I belong, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church?
The NAACP as an institution, as an organization, gets very little support from the white church community of America, Protestant or Catholic. Very little support. There was a time back in the what we call the heyday of the civil rights movement when the churches were actively involved with the NAACP. However, I had another organization known as the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. Now that is an umbrella organization of 165 groups, including NAACP, including many Roman Catholic groups, Jewish groups, Protestant groups. And in that grouping, we get a great deal of support, but that is primarily directed toward legislative goals in the Congress. But as an organization, the NAACP has not gotten any financial support from the white church community of any substance in a number of years. It seemed that the interest went somewhere else after the marches were over and the Civil Rights Act was passed, that they didn't have the interest they once had in seeing to it that black folk really achieved equality of citizenship. I've been very disappointed, and I will be making some efforts to see to it that the churches do it. I have qualified my position, however, by pointing out that in the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, that umbrella organization from both the Jewish community, the Protestant community, and the Catholic religious community, we work together in concert on many legislative goals.
Dr. Hooks, my name is Fitzroy Batiste, lecturer in African history at the university here in Trinidad. And my question touches on the historical and other relationships between Afro-America and the Afro-Caribbean. I would like to find out from you whether it's generally known in Afro-America that this year, 1988, marks the 150th anniversary of the final end of legal slavery in these parts. And if so, do you have any plans up there in Afro-America to commemorate this event, especially among the Afro-West Indian community in New York and so on?
I am afraid, and rather ashamed to admit it, that we have been so preoccupied in these past few years of what we see as a resurgence of racism in continental USA that we have not paid enough attention to our brothers and sisters in many places. Let me preface it, however, by saying this. Way back in the 1900s, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of our eminent founders, convened the first Pan-African Congress. Again, it was convened in 1919, and NAACP took a leading role. In fact, our 1919 convention had the question of liberation of Africa as a principal convention topic for that year. Through the years, we've maintained a very definite interest in the African situation, not simply South Africa, but all of the countries that were governed by imperialistic powers. And we think we were instrumental in bringing about an end to colonial rule. we are still very heavily involved in the continent of Africa as a domestic organization. The NAACP at one time had as its executive secretary James Weldon Johnson, who at one time was the consul to Haiti. And we spent historically a great deal of time on the great nation of Haiti, trying to make that a better and more livable place and to have more suitable policies. We even got involved just a few years ago with the question of Haitian immigrants to this country, those who came by boat or however, and who were turned back, and yet waves of other people allowed to come. But in the Caribbean, we have not manifested, I don't think, the type of interest we should. And I must say to you very openly that I hope that we can begin to coordinate from this day forward some real good activities between our neighbors in the Caribbean and the American mainland, and particularly elimination of the stigma of slavery from those very wonderful and proud nations in that part of the world. We have a lot to be grateful for. West Indian immigration to America created a tremendous force for good, a power for solidarity, and the black movement in America would have been much the less had we not had so many marvelous people from the West Indian nations that come here and cast their lot in this nation. So we will be looking, and I will try to lead some of my friends into bigger and better celebrations, because injustice anywhere, as Dr. King put it, is a threat to justice everywhere. And freedom and liberty and equality anywhere is an encouragement to freedom, liberty, equality everywhere. There's an intermingling between the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and an intermingling between the end of slavery in Canada and the Caribbean and the end of slavery in America. And we must never forget that, and our friends who live in other countries must work with us and remind us constantly of what we have to do.
Dr. Hooks, David DeCary, Stabrook News. Would you be willing to comment on the recent debacle in Haiti, which is a very live issue in the Caribbean?
Yes. I am not and do not consider myself an expert on Haiti. We did get very involved with the question of Haitians, immigrants, as I said a moment ago, and I would have hoped that beautiful land and marvelous people would have been able to have a democratic election where the will of the people could have been freely expressed. From what I read in the press accounts here in America, that did not happen, and the nation will be the poorer because of that. However, it is at least some sign of progress that the election was held at all, and we can only hope and pray that whoever is elected president will begin to exercise democratic rule and not resort to any kind of autocratic tyranny. The people of Haiti have suffered for a long time, and they deserve the opportunity to be self-governing. And while this election seemed to have been, from what I've read in the American press now, and I've not been there, from what I've read, seemed to have been not what we had hoped for in terms of full free expression, at least it is a beginning. The late President John Kennedy said the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. And perhaps in that great and beautiful country of Haiti, we've seen that one step, and hopefully they will move forward now to embrace democracy. And there's some suffering involved in moving into that direction. Freedom of expression, freedom of press, freedom of movement, freedom to dissent, freedom to disagree is an important ingredient in a newly evolving democracy. But we hope that will happen and that Haiti will be the better for it.
Now I must end today's discussion. I'd like to thank all our guests for joining us today. As a reminder, credit for today's program should be given to WorldNet, the television and film service of the United States Information Agency. In Washington, I'm Jude Lindley. Good day.